For 3 nights, the blizzard had erased the trail behind Mara Vale. By the 4th morning, she was no longer walking toward a cabin. She was walking toward smoke. A thin, black thread rose beyond the pines, trembling in the white air, and she fixed her eyes on it because everything else had started to blur. Her boots were split. Her fingers had lost their shape inside the wet wool wrapped around them, and against her chest, under a shawl and a piece of torn flour sack, her daughter had become so still that Mara kept pressing her mouth to the child's forehead, just to feel whether warmth was still there. The baby had cried through the first day, whimpered through the second. By the third, Ruthie made no sound at all. That silence was what pushed Mara up the last rise. Not courage, not hope, only terror. The cabin stood low against the mountain, half buried in drifted snow, with a roof steep enough to throw off the storm, and a chimney smoking like a promise. Mara reached the door and lifted her fist, but her knuckles barely touched the wood. So she kicked it, once, then again. The door opened with such force that wind rushed in around her, and the man in the doorway filled almost the entire frame. He was younger than she expected, and rougher than any man she had ever asked mercy from. Tall, broad, black hair tied at the neck, a beard thick with frost. His eyes were the dark green of pine needles under ice. Mara tried to say his name, Silas, but her jaw would not move. Instead, she pulled the cloth away from Ruthie's face. The man looked down. Whatever warning had been on his tongue disappeared. The baby's lips were blue. For one long second, he did not move. Then he stepped aside. Inside. It was not soft. It was not welcoming. It was the voice of a man who had seen something dying and knew there was no time to be gentle about the door. Mara crossed the threshold, and heat struck her so hard her knees folded. Silas caught her by the arm before she fell. His other hand went toward the bundle. She tightened around Ruthie without thinking. "I'm not taking her," he said. "I'm trying to keep her breathing." Those words passed through the fog in Mara's head. She let go. Silas carried the baby to the hearth and laid her on a sheepskin where the firelight could reach her. He unwrapped the frozen layers with hands that looked made for axes, but moved with a frightening care. One cloth, then another, then the little dress stiff with cold. Ruthie did not wake. He bent low, listening at her mouth, then her chest. Then he pressed 2 fingers beneath the tiny jaw. Mara stood behind him, shaking so hard her teeth clicked. 4 months? He asked. Almost 5. What has she had today? Snow water, a little barley broth. She would not take it. Milk? Mara swallowed. The cow died near Fort Benton. I traded the last of the salt pork for a cup of goat milk 2 days ago. Silas did not scold her. Somehow, that made it worse. He moved to a shelf above the table and began taking things down. A tin cup, a brown bottle, a pinch of dried leaves from a cloth packet. He warmed a little milk from a clay jug at the edge of the hearth, cooled it against his wrist, and dipped the corner of clean linen into it. Not too much, he muttered. Not fast. He touched the linen to Ruthie's mouth. Nothing. Then, a tiny movement. Her lips closed weakly around the cloth. Mara made a sound that was almost a sob, but Silas lifted one hand. Quiet. Let her choose it. Drop by drop, the baby swallowed. After the 10th drop, her eyelids fluttered. Silas went still. Ruthie opened her eyes. They were grey, not blue, not brown. The hard, storm-grey eyes of Mara's dead husband. Silas saw it. Mara saw him see it. His face changed so quickly that anyone else might have missed it. A flinch moved behind his eyes and vanished. He dipped the linen again. What is her name? Ruth. I call her Ruthie. His thumb brushed the baby's cheek once, so lightly it could have been an accident. Jonah's child, he said. Mara could only nod. The room tipped sideways. Silas caught her again, this time with both hands, and guided her to the single chair by the table. You eat, she feeds, then you sleep. I need to tell you, you need to stay upright long enough to tell me. He brought stew from a black pot, thick with beans, turnip, and strips of smoked meat. Mara tried to hold the spoon, but her fingers would not close. Silas watched for 1 second. Then he took the bowl back, sat across from her, and placed the spoon into her hand the way one might set a tool into the grip of someone learning its weight. Slow. She obeyed because there was no strength left for pride. The cabin was not large, but it was clean in a way that made loneliness visible. One bed against the far wall, one chair, one table. Tools hung in perfect rows, firewood stacked by size. Shelves lined with jars, tins, folded cloth, salves, twine, and nails. No decoration except a cracked blue mug on the mantel, and a child's wooden horse lying on its side near a closed trunk. Mara noticed the toy and looked away. Silas noticed her noticing. His face went blank. When she had eaten half the bowl, he took Ruthie into the crook of his arm and fed her another few drops. The baby swallowed more strongly now. Her hands opened and closed in the air, small pink fists returning to life. The sight broke Mara. She turned her face aside, but the tears came anyway. Silas said nothing. He only stood, took a blanket from the bed, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Sleep there, he said, nodding toward the mattress. I can't take your bed. You already brought winter through my door. The bed is nothing. It was the closest thing to kindness he had given her. Mara lay down with her boots still on. The last thing she saw was Silas by the fire, the silent baby against his chest, his huge hand cupped over her back, as if he were holding a bird that might fly away if he breathed wrong. When Mara woke, morning had turned the window white. The storm had stopped. Ruthie was asleep in a basket of folded wool near the hearth, her breathing thin but steady. Silas sat on the floor beside her, back against the wall, a rifle across his knees. He looked as if he had not slept at all. You found me, he said. It was not a question. Mara pushed herself upright. Her body ached in separate pieces. Jonah told me where to go if I had nowhere else. At the sound of his brother's name, Silas looked at the fire. Mara told him everything because there was no use choosing the pretty parts. She told him how Jonah had left the Bitterroot country after a fight with his older brother and found work hauling timber for a sawmill outside Missoula. How he had rented a corner room above a laundry and met Mara when she came to mend torn work shirts for the men in camp. How he laughed too loudly, gave away half his wages, and wrote his brother's name on envelopes he never sent. They had married in autumn, with 2 witnesses and no ring, because Jonah said he did not need gold to promise forever. She told him he had been killed 6 weeks before Ruthie was born. Not in battle, not in some grand accident worth printing, but beneath a load of wet pine that slipped its chain and crushed him before anyone could lift it. Silas did not move, only his jaw tightened. "The mill paid me $12, Mara said. They said I should be grateful because I was not on their books." Silas turned then. His eyes were no longer blank. "They gave you $12 for my brother?" For a widow they did not want to remember. The room seemed to shrink around him. Mara continued before grief could swallow her voice. "I tried to stay. I sewed until my hands bled. I took washing. I sold the stove. Then the landlord put my trunk in the street when Ruthie had fever. Jonah always said, 'If the world turns mean, go to Silas. He can survive anything.'" A bitter sound left Silas's throat. "He said that?" "He said you were the strongest man he knew." Silas stood so fast, the chair scraped the floor, though he had not been sitting in it. He walked to the window and stared out at the white mountain. "Strong men answer letters," he said. Mara was quiet. "He wrote me once," Silas continued, "after he married you. Said he was happy. Said he was sorry for what he said when he left. Said he hoped I had stopped talking to ghosts." His hand closed around the window frame. I burned the letter without answering. Mara looked down at Ruthie. "He never stopped hoping you would." Silas shut his eyes. "He had no right to send you here." "He had every right," Mara said, and surprised herself with the steadiness of it. "You were his blood. She is his blood. I was not looking for comfort. I was looking for a door that might open before my child stopped breathing." Silas turned back. For a moment, something almost human fought its way through the stone of him. Then he looked at the baby. "The past will stay buried until April," he said. "You can remain until then." Mara nodded. "After that, I'll take you down to the valley. There is a settlement with a schoolhouse and a church. You can find work there." It was shelter, not welcome. But shelter had smoke and milk and a roof that did not leak. So Mara said, "Thank you." Silas grabbed his coat from a peg by the door. "Do not thank me yet." He went out into the blue-white morning and left her with the sound of the door bar dropping into place. The first weeks taught Mara the rules of Silas Voss's world. The fire was never allowed to die. The water bucket stayed half full. The axe was sharpened before supper, never after dark. No food was wasted. No tool was put down dirty. Question was asked twice, because Silas answered most of them before she gathered the courage to speak. He rose before dawn, tended the 2 milk goats in the lean-to, checked snares, split wood, and disappeared into the trees with a rifle over his shoulder. He returned with rabbits, grouse, sometimes nothing, and accepted both failure and success with the same quiet face. He spoke to Mara in instructions. Boil this. Hold her upright after feeding. Keep the cradle basket away from the draft. Do not open the door when the wind comes from the north. He did not ask what she dreamed. He did not ask whether her hands had stopped shaking. He did not ask what Jonah sounded like when he laughed. But he watched Ruthie. Mara saw it when he thought she was busy mending or stirring the pot. His eyes would drift to the basket by the hearth. If the baby coughed, his fingers paused around whatever tool he held. If she fussed, his shoulders tightened before Mara even stood. On the 11th night, Ruthie cried properly for the first time. Not a weak little complaint. A furious, offended wail that filled the cabin from rafters to floorboards. The Mara rushed to her, but Silas was already standing with his bowl of stew untouched in his hand. The sound had startled him, as if a shot had gone off. Then he listened, really listened, and something in his face loosened. "She has lungs," he said. Mara laughed once, broken and tired. "Yes, she does." Silas looked embarrassed by his own relief and carried his bowl to the wash basin. "I will check the goats." "It's snowing sideways." "They may need checking." He left for nearly an hour. When he came back, his beard was white with snow, and his eyes were careful again. That was when Mara understood. Silas was not made of coldness. He was guarding a wound that the baby's every breath touched. She did not press him. Pressure would only send him deeper into the trees. Instead, she learned the quiet ways of sharing a room with a man who had forgotten rooms could hold more than silence. She swept without asking, mended his gloves, set coffee near his hand before he reached for it, sang to Ruthie in a low voice when the wind bullied the shutters. In return, Silas left extra wood by the stove before dawn. He returned from the ridge with a twist of wintergreen for her tea. He fixed the broken latch on her trunk without mentioning it. He placed a strip of fox fur inside Ruthie's blanket on the coldest nights and pretended it had always been there. One morning, Mara woke to find him kneeling beside the basket. His hand rested on Ruthie's chest, not pressing, just feeling the rise and fall. The fire had burned low. Gray light lay on his face. For once, he looked less like a mountain and more like a man at the edge of prayer. When he noticed Mara watching, he pulled his hand away as if the child had burned him. She was breathing too shallow. "Thank you." He stood. "I am not fond of thanks." "I know." He reached for his coat, stopped, and spoke without turning. "The basket is too small. She will roll soon." "She is not rolling yet." "She will." That afternoon, Mara heard sawing from the lean-to. Then, for 2 days, Silas worked behind the closed door, coming in with shavings stuck to his sleeves and saying nothing. On the third evening, he carried in a cradle made from pine, plain but solid, with curved rockers and a small moon carved into the headboard. Mara touched the smooth wood. "You made this?" It needed making. No one asked. She cannot sleep in a basket forever. He set Ruthie inside with great seriousness, adjusted the blanket, and stepped back. The baby blinked up at him. Then she caught one of his fingers. Silas froze. Her hand was so small that it closed only around the first joint. Mara watched his throat move. For several seconds, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath with him. Then Ruthie smiled. Not gas, not sleep. A true, crooked, sudden smile. Silas looked terrified. He took his finger away, turned, and walked out into the dusk without his coat. Mara found it hanging by the door and did not follow. That night he came back long after the stars were out. He had cut no wood, carried no meat, brought in nothing except the look of a man who had run as far as he could and found his grief waiting for him at the tree line. Mara was feeding Ruthie near the fire. Silas stood by the door. "I had a daughter," he said. The spoon in Mara's hand stilled. He did not come closer. "Her name was Elise. My wife called her Ellie before she was even born. I never held her alive." Mara's chest tightened. "Silas." "My wife was Beatrice. Fever took her after 2 days. The child went before morning. Jonah was here then. He dug because I could not stand. He kept the fire going. He tried to make me eat, tried to make me speak." The wind moved against the cabin with a low animal sound. I hated him for being alive enough to try. Mara said nothing. "I told him to leave," Silas continued. "I told him a man with soft hands and soft hope had no place on this mountain. He left before dawn. 5 years later, his wife carries his starving child through my door, and I am supposed to know what to do with that." His voice broke on the last word. Not loudly, but enough to crack the room open. Mara rose, Ruthie tucked against her shoulder. "You kept her breathing." "That is not the same as knowing what to do." "It is the first thing." Silas looked at the cradle. "I thought if I needed nothing, nothing could be taken." Mara stepped closer, slowly. "That is not how loss works." "No. It takes even from empty rooms." He looked at her then. For the first time, he was not hiding the grief. It stood in him, large and old and exhausted. Mara wanted to touch his hand, but she did not know whether the offer would help or hurt. So she only stood with Ruthie between them, the child breathing warm little breaths into the shawl. After a long while, Silas whispered, "She has his eyes." "She does." "And his stubborn mouth." "That may be mine." To Mara's surprise, Silas almost smiled. Almost. It was enough. Winter settled deeper after that, but the cabin changed. Not all at once, not like a door opening, more like ice thinning under steady sun. Silas began to stay inside after supper. At first, he busied himself with work, repairing harness, oiling tools, carving pegs for the wall. Then, slowly, his hands became less important than the sound in the room. Mara read aloud from the only book she owned, a battered primer she had carried wrapped in her shawl, because Jonah had once written their names on the inside cover. The pages were meant for children, full of simple words and moral lessons. But Silas listened as if every sentence had crossed a desert to reach him. One evening, she found a second book on the table, leather-bound, water-stained, its spine cracked. "Where did this come from?" "Trunk." "Yours?" "Jonah's. He left it here before he went west." She opened it carefully. A book of poems. Inside the front cover, in Jonah's restless handwriting, were the words, "For my brother, who hears more than he says." Mara looked up. Silas was sharpening a knife too hard. "He read at night," Silas said, "when B could not sleep." "Would you like me to read it?" "No." Then, after a pause, "Yes." So she read. She read poems of rivers, snowfields, lost horses, long roads, women waiting by windows, men returning too late, and the strange mercy of wild places. Ruthie slept. The fire shifted. Silas stared into the flames like a man being shown the shape of something he had buried and forgotten where. After that, reading became part of the evening. So did talking. Not much at first, a sentence here, a memory there. Silas told her Jonah once tried to ride a half-broken mule backward on a dare and broke his wrist in 2 places. Mara told him Jonah snored only when he had worked himself nearly sick. Silas said Jonah hated turnips. Mara said he had pretended to love them because she cooked them badly the first month they were married. They laughed, then they cried, sometimes in the same breath. By February, Ruthie had grown round-cheeked and loud. She followed Silas with her eyes whenever he crossed the room. If he came inside without greeting her, she complained until he leaned over the cradle and offered one solemn finger. "Good evening, Miss Ruth," he would say, whenever he crossed the room. If he came inside without greeting her, she complained until he leaned over the cradle and offered one solemn finger. "Good evening, Miss Ruth," he would say. She would seize him like a debt collector. Mara began to notice other things. Silas always ate after she had filled her own bowl. He never let her carry water when the steps were iced. He slept lightly, waking at the smallest change in Ruthie's breathing. He placed the cracked blue mug on the table beside Mara each morning, because she had once said she liked how it fit her hands. And once, when she sang a lullaby Jonah had loved, Silas stood at the window with his back to her until the song ended. When he turned around, his eyes were wet. But he did not leave the room. That mattered. The mountain tried one last time to take them in March. A warm day softened the upper snow, and by evening the ridge above the goat shed cracked loose. It came down with a roar that shook soot from the rafters. Silas was outside. Mara heard the sound and knew before she reached the door. Snow had buried the lean-to up to the roofline. She wrapped Ruthie, shoved her into the cradle away from the draft, and ran out with a shovel. The cold hit her lungs like knives. "Silas!" No answer, only the goats screaming beneath the drift. She dug where the wall had been. Her hands burned. Snow filled her sleeves. She shouted his name until her throat tore. Then the snow shifted. A gloved hand broke through near the corner post. Mara dropped to her knees and dug with the shovel, then with her fingers, then with anything that could move snow faster than terror. Silas came up coughing, face white, blood at his hairline. "Go inside," he rasped. "No! The roof! No!" Together, they dug out the goats before the weakened wall gave way completely. By the time they stumbled back into the cabin, Mara could barely feel her legs. Silas barred the door, turned to say something harsh, and instead swayed. Mara caught him as best she could. He was too heavy, but he leaned into her for 1 second before catching himself. At the table, she cleaned the cut above his temple. Her hands shook from cold and anger. "You could have died." "I did not." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I have." "No, it is not." Silas looked at her. All winter, Mara had been careful not to push him, but fear had burned the carefulness out of her. "You think being alone means no one can lose you," she said. "But I was out there digging like the whole mountain was sitting on my chest. Ruthie would have grown up reaching for a man who was not there. And I would have had to keep breathing in another room, made empty by a man I loved." The word landed before she could pull it back. Silas did not move. Mara turned away quickly, reaching for a clean cloth. "I'm sorry." His hand caught her wrist, not hard. "Mara." She kept her eyes on the table. "I did not mean to say it like that. I have been trying not to hear it." She looked up. Silas's face was pale from the cold, but his eyes were steady. "I've been trying not to hear my own heart say it first." The fire popped. Ruthie stirred in the cradle, then settled. Silas took the cloth from Mara's hand and set it down. "When Jonah died, he still trusted me with the 2 people he loved most," he said. "I hated him for that before I understood. It was the last gift he could give me." Mara's eyes filled. "I don't want to be a duty." "You are not. I don't want Ruthie to be a wound you keep reopening because you think you owe your brother. She is not a wound." His thumb moved once over her wrist. "She is a breath in a house that forgot how." Mara could not speak, stepped closer. "I do not know how to be gentle every day. I do not know how to stop bracing for loss. I will make mistakes. I will go silent when I should speak. I will need reminding that a door can open without danger standing behind it." His voice lowered. "But I want you here when the pass clears. I want Ruthie here. I want to build a room where her cradle belongs, not just a corner where it fits. I want to learn the sound of a morning that has both of you in it." Mara let the tears fall. "That sounds like more than duty." "It is." He lifted her hand to his chest. His heart beat hard beneath her palm. "It is the first thing I have wanted without feeling ashamed of wanting it." Mara leaned into him then, and his arms came around her with the same fierce care he had used on Ruthie the first night. He held her as if the holding itself were a promise he was still learning how to keep. Their first kiss was not dramatic. No thunder, no swelling music, no perfect words. Only a bleeding man, a shaking woman, a sleeping child, and a cabin that no longer felt like a shelter built against the world. It felt like something the world had not managed to destroy. By April, the pass opened. Silas rode down to the valley alone and returned with flour, seed potatoes, lamp oil, a length of blue ribbon for Ruthie, and news that the preacher would come through after Easter. He did not ask Mara to leave. She did not pack. Instead, he walked her to the south slope where two small wooden crosses stood beneath a pine that caught the earliest sun. He cleared the snow from the names with his glove. Beatrice Voss, Elise Voss. Mara stood beside him with Ruthie in her arms. "I was afraid bringing you here would mean asking them to move over," Silas said. Mara looked at the little graves, then at the mountain beyond. Love does not move the dead out of the heart. It teaches the living there is still room. Silas bowed his head. For a long time they stood in silence. Then Ruthie reached for one of the crosses, not understanding grief, only seeing wood and light and her own desire to touch everything. Silas laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him. Mara turned toward the sound, and the spring air seemed to change around them. He began building the new room the next week. Not a grand house, nothing a town woman would have admired. Just a wider cabin with 2 windows facing east, a real bedchamber, a loft for when Ruthie grew older, and a shelf by the hearth for books instead of tools. Mara helped where she could, holding planks, marking cloth for curtains, planting onions and beans in the patch Silas turned with a hand plow. Ruthie watched from a sling on Mara's back, or from the cradle under the porch shade, shouting at the world as if she owned it. Sometimes Silas would stop work just to answer her. "Yes, Miss Ruth, I see the stump." "Yes, Miss Ruth, the hammer is loud." "No, Miss Ruth, you may not eat a wood shaving." Mara would laugh until he glanced at her, embarrassed and pleased at once. In May, the preacher came. They married in the clearing between the old cabin and the half-built room. No guests but the goats, the pines, and Ruthie, who interrupted the vows by sneezing so loudly that even the preacher lost his place. Silas did not wear a fine coat. Mara did not have a white dress. The ring was plain iron, hammered from a piece of Jonah's old trap chain that Silas had kept in the trunk without knowing why. When he slid it onto Mara's finger, his hands trembled. "I kept the chain because I could not throw away what belonged to him," he whispered. "Now it belongs to us." Mara covered his hand with hers. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Silas kissed her under a sky washed clean by spring. Then he bent and lifted Ruthie between them. Baby grabbed his beard with both fists. Silas did not pull away. He looked at Mara over Ruthie's dark head, and the old grief was still there in him, but it no longer stood alone. "This is my family," he said. Not like he was testing the words, like he had found them. Mara looked at the cabin that had first opened to her in a storm. She looked at the smoke rising now from its chimney, no longer a desperate mark against the snow, but a quiet sign that someone was expected inside. For 3 nights she had followed smoke because there was nothing else to follow. Now the mountain held a door, a fire, a cradle, 2 graves in the sun, and a man who had learned that needing people did not make him weak. It made him alive. Ruthie laughed, bright and sudden. Silas laughed with her. And for the first time since Mara had climbed that ridge with a silent child against her chest, The cabin did not feel like it was holding its breath. It was breathing with them.